Hello, my name's Cathy. I'm a recently retired A&E doctor. I was born in India to a diplomatic family. I grew up knowing I was going to go to boarding school. When my 11-year-old brother left for school, I didn't understand the significance and I wasn't afraid about my own future. A couple of years later, it was my turn. I was only 9, but my parents said I wanted to go. Perhaps that was true because I'd read all these fun books about children at boarding school. When we were in England on leave, my parents drove me to boarding school. I don't remember that journey. What I do remember was that by lights out that first night, all my hopes that I would have a fun time like Joe of the chalet school had vanished. I was utterly miserable. The matrons had shouted at me for crying. I had learnt that being homesick was weak, and I had to shed my tears in secret. I didn't know that I was feeling abandoned and betrayed. I didn't know that I was not the only little girl feeling like that, but I didn't have any language to articulate it. In the junior school, bullying made things a whole lot worse. I tried to tell my parents in the weekly letter home, but how could I without the words to express it? I doubt it would have made a difference anyway, because my parents were expected to send their children to boarding schools. The fees were paid by the Foreign Office, and they also paid the cost of flights out home twice a year. Like their friends, also overseas parents, they were completely convinced that boarding school was the best education I could ever have, and I was reminded of the privilege quite frequently. This disparity between what my parents thought about it and my actual experience was a gulf that could not be crossed. My parents did not go to boarding school themselves. As an adult, they told me that they thought I was fine once I got back to school. And to be fair, I'd given up trying to tell them. My letters home colluded with their views and I just wrote what they wanted to hear. I also thought none of the other girls felt the same way I did, and it made us all probably very isolated. At school, I'd learnt to suppress my emotions, but as the end of the holidays approached, I could not hold back my tears. My parents actually took me to the doctor and I was prescribed tranquilizers for the long plane journey back to school. But by the time I hit my teens, my parents were concerned enough that they thought maybe a change of school might help. So, after 4 years, in the 4th form, the year before O-levels, I was moved to a smaller school, supposedly with a family atmosphere. It was disastrous. My parents had fallen off their pedestal and I started to blame them. Not entirely though, because for a long time I'd known I was bad. I had a negative self-image established before I went to school. That's another story. So, almost 14, I reproached myself for letting it happen. I was an angry, resentful adolescent with no way of expressing my distress. The only upside was the new school was closer to my uncle, and I visited his family on the rare weekends out in the short half term. I guess it was hardly surprising that I latched on to any affection. My uncle was a Baptist minister, and I had a well-developed propensity for self-blame. So I didn't need any convincing that I was a sinner in need of salvation, and soon I was a born-again Christian with a brand new set of conflicting and confusing ideas. Back at home, my parents were not enamoured by my conversion to Christianity, but I was terrified by the evangelical doctrine that they might die and go to hell. I had no idea how to cope. My uncle's affirmation was too vital to give it up. But the newfound faith gave me a reason for the move to the awful school where I didn't fit in. In the 5th year at school, I was admitted to hospital with possible rheumatic fever. By the time I got home in the holidays, I told my parents I didn't want to go back. But they told me that if I didn't go back, I could forget any dreams of becoming a doctor. With Hobson's choice, reluctantly, I complied. My O-level results were poor, but I used to work harder in response to stress, and this coping strategy gave me what I needed, and I left school with the necessary grades. At university, I thought I could forget about boarding school. I felt liberated and I didn't want to go home. I met my husband in the second year and we were married. By the time of the final year, I had a baby. This meant that I delayed my career until our family was completed. At 31, I started work. By 34, I was in crisis, triggered by a resurgence of boarding school memories. The GP diagnosed this as depression and told me that antidepressants were the answer. SSRIs, like Prozac, were being heavily marketed at the time, and few doctors were aware that they could make some people suicidal. That was the beginning of my nightmare. I was admitted to psychiatric hospitals, slept in a dormitory, not allowed to leave of my own volition, subjected to bullying, and this repeated invariably during term time, and I tried to be home for the school holidays. The NHS psychiatrists and therapists never believed that boarding school was of real significance. Instead, I was highly susceptible to coercion, and they convinced me that I had treatment-resistant depression, a chemical imbalance, a myth believed even today. No wonder the numerous drugs and ECT didn't help, and over 7 years I went downhill, sedated to a zombie, but it didn't stop me self-harming, and I was still suicidal, despite the best psychiatry could offer. I even was subjected to psychosurgery before I had a brief respite. I did return to work for a short time, still completely ignorant that there was no scientific evidence that the theory of depression as a physical brain condition. I was also completely ignorant about withdrawal from psychiatric drugs. So I was re-traumatized as a psychiatric patient, had no resolution to boarding school issues. I went in for round 2. By 2009, my faith in psychiatry was dwindling and I started to withdraw my medication slowly. By 2017, I'd actually met a therapist who identified immediately that boarding school had been the root cause of my problems all along. She was the only one who also saw the pattern that every admission mimicked boarding school for me. She was a compassionate listener, empathised, and was appalled by what I'd been through. I felt validated and the healing journey really began. My experience as a psychiatric patient was extreme, but I was able to extricate myself, and with this valuable counselling, I have been better than ever. By 2019, I discovered there were other boarding school survivors with similar experiences of school. I know emotional problems arise often through childhood adversity, but I don't think doctors and therapists in psychiatry so often grasp the complexity of the boarding school experience. Without a dramatic story, the impact of emotional neglect and abuse may go unrecognised. Yet, we can be badly hurt even without the additional terrible trauma of physical and sexual abuse. And for me as an adult, the consequences were devastating. It's important not to rank the seriousness of any individual's experience, because after all, it may not sound so bad on the surface. But the good news is that we can all heal. I still work on my survival behaviours and self-care. I feel alive, and I appreciate so much how far I've come. Now I'm keen to help. I know that everyone has a unique pathway to personal growth and healing. Before I end, I just want to add a note of caution. Please don't stop psychiatric drugs suddenly. You need medical advice to avoid suffering the severe withdrawal reactions. That was something I did go through as well. But anyway, thank you for listening.
You think that was better?